Before we begin, take a deep breath. Let your eyes soften, or close if you'd like. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, you're here now. You're safe. Welcome back to this quiet place. We don't need to go anywhere loud. We don't need to understand everything at once. We can just sit here together and begin again. Slowly. You were once a child. Not poor, but not noble either. Tucked between wild green hills and the slow breathing of the woods. Your family lived near the edge of a forest, where your father worked with wood and iron, shaping barrels with hands steady and sure. Sometimes you helped him, even when your grip fumbled, even when your arms ached from holding tools too heavy. He never scolded. He only laughed gently and said, "You'll be strong enough someday, just not today." That line sank into you, quiet and deep, like roots. It stayed through the years. It waited in the corners of your mind, in the shape of your shoulders as they grew broader, in the calluses your hands slowly earned. You didn't dream of glory then, but you dreamed of horses, of riding beyond the fields you knew, of wearing something that gleamed in sunlight. You found smooth stones in the stream and told yourself they were coins for your future steed. You kept them in a pouch. You told stories to the chickens and practiced a brave voice when no one was near. You saved fallen branches from puddles and called them lost swords. You made armor out of bark and silence. And one day, when you were 11, a knight passed through your village. His armor didn't shine. It was dull with dust, scratched at the knees, like it had remembered every road it crossed. But he moved like a story. He stayed one night, spoke only to the priest, and left before the sky turned light again. But in that small moment, he saw you, just for a second, a flicker of eye to eye, and something in that glance lit a quiet fire in your chest that never fully faded. After that, you trained alone. You woke earlier each morning. You ran up the hill behind the orchard, where the grass grew thick and the wind carried crow songs. You carved your own wooden sword, rough and splintered. You lifted water buckets like weights. You asked the old man near the mill, the one who drank more than he spoke, to show you how to hold your feet when it mattered. He did. Sometimes he even smiled. You asked your mother to stitch extra padding into your coat. It told her it was for the cold. She raised a brow but did it anyway. You never said what it was really for. You kept that part quiet. And when you turned 14, you left without a word, just before dawn, with bread in your satchel and your heart thudding like a drum. You walked 23 miles to the castle. Your feet bled. But you didn't stop. When you arrived, the guard at the gate laughed, until he saw your eyes. Then he stopped. They took you in, not because you were special, but because you didn't act like you needed to be. You worked hard, harder than anyone. You cleaned armor and ashes, slept in a narrow cot beside 5 others. I learned to listen more than speak. You missed your mother's bread. You missed the trees. But you stayed. You learned. And then, one morning, you held a sword for the first time. Not wood. Not pretend. Real cold and waiting in your hands. It wasn't ceremony. It wasn't thunder. Just the weight of metal and the way your fingers closed around it like they'd been waiting their whole life for this. Something in you shifted, quietly, like a stream changing course beneath the surface. The blade was heavier than you expected. Your hands ached after only a few minutes, but you didn't complain. You simply changed your grip and tried again. And again. That was the day the path became real. Not easier, Never easier, but clearer. You weren't pretending anymore. Your mentor was a man named Sadarin. He wasn't loud. He wasn't grand. He didn't wear plumes or shout commands. But when he entered the yard, even the wind paused. He corrected with calm, never raised his voice. When you swung too wide, he said, waste of motion. When you lunged without balance, he murmured, fall in battle once. You'll remember. And when after weeks, months, aching bones and endless dusk practices, you finally landed your first clean strike, he only said, good. One word, but it filled your chest like light. You carried it with you. Training became your world. Before dawn, after dusk, forms until your muscles burned. Sparring with squires taller, stronger. You lost often, but you never stopped. The pain stopped feeling like punishment. It became a kind of language, a message. You slept on thin straw, ate quickly, dreamed of nothing but steel and silence. And yet, in the quiet, something else began to grow, a kind of calm, a steadiness. You were not yet a knight, but you were no longer a boy with stones in his pouch and bark armor on his shoulders. You were becoming something else. One day, a visitor came to the castle, a woman, older, eyes like flint, wearing a pale blue pendant. She watched you spar, said little, then spoke to the steward and pointed once. That one, she said, send him. You didn't know what it meant, but the next morning, you were saddled and ready, sent to ride with 3 others, older squires, eyes already sharpened by distance. It wasn't a grand mission, a caravan escort, muddy roads, rain in your boots, thieves that were more hungry than dangerous. You patched leather in the cold, took turns keeping watch, learned how to look like you knew what you were doing, even when you didn't. No one thanked you, but when the journey ended, the merchant looked at you and said, you didn't run, and somehow, that meant more than all the praise you hadn't earned. You returned to the castle, changed, not taller, not broader, just kite, still. At 16, you saw your first battlefield, not as a knight, not even as a fighter. You were there to carry water, to hold reins, to deliver orders. But you saw what war looked like, what it smelled like, what it remembered, sweat and steel and something older grief. Maybe, or the part of fear that no one names. You saw Sir Darren ride into the fray, calm and silent, no shouting, no show, just a red coat and a sword that didn't swing unless it had to. You watched him fall once, Brise again. You helped a soldier back to the cart, a boy not much older than you, blood pouring from his thigh. Did I do something worth remembering? He asked. You lied, said yes. He died that night. Afterward, you sat beneath a tree, washed your hands 4 times, still felt them wet, looked at your sword, steel sheathed, untouched, and you wondered not if you were brave enough, but if this was what you were meant for, not the fighting, the after, the wait. Sir Darren found you there, didn't say much, just sat down. After a long while, he murmured, a sword is the last thing a knight should be known for. You nodded, didn't understand. Not then, but you carried that line with you. You still do. You were 17 when they gave you a horse. Not as a gift, not as a ceremony, Just a simple assignment. A sign. She wasn't beautiful. Her coat was patchy. Her left ear torn from an old fight. And she didn't listen the first time. Or the second. She tested you. Pulled left. Refused to move. Stopped when you wanted her to run. But you didn't fight her. You waited. Spoke softly. Rode quietly. And within a week, you rode as one. Not because she bent to your will, but because she chose to walk beside it. Her name was Bren, and you never forced her to gallop. You never asked someone else to brush her down. You groomed her yourself each night. Hands slow and careful. This was your first true bond as a knight, not with steel, not with status, but with a creature who owed you nothing and stayed anyway. Some knights mocked you for it. Others watched in silence, then began doing the same. A quiet change, the kind that ripples wider than the one who starts it. You were called to stand before the court. The Lord asked your name, what you wanted. You answered, to serve. He frowned, not to rise, and you said, if rising does not serve, it is only rising. There was a silence, a smile from someone behind him, a name written in a ledger. You didn't ask why. Later, Sir Darren told you it meant your name would be remembered. You thought of the boy you had been whispering to chickens, collecting stones. You thought of your father's hands, your mother's bread folded into cloth, and you whispered to yourself, let memory be enough. You didn't want glory. You wanted to be good, and good takes longer. You began mentoring younger pages, not because you were told to, but because you remembered how it felt to be unseen. You taught them how to grip a sword. Yes, but also how to read a face, how to notice fear, not as weakness, but as warning, how a knight must listen before they act. One boy asked you, what's the hardest part? And after a long pause, you said, coming home. He didn't understand. That was fine. One day he would. You placed your hand on his shoulder, and in that moment, you felt like a tree, not young, not old, just steady. The kind of tree that gives shelter long after it stops growing. That winter, your patrol was ambushed. You survived. Barely. A blade cut across your shoulder. You didn't feel it at first. You kept fighting. Not for victory, but for the others. When it was over, you collapsed. You woke days later in the infirmary. Your arm wrapped in linen. Your breath shallow. Sir Darren sat beside you. He didn't ask questions, didn't praise, only said, you didn't leave anyone behind. You fell asleep again to the sound of rain on stone. When you woke next, a cloth was folded neatly beside your bed. No signature, just 4 words. You are still here. You didn't know who left it. You never asked, but you kept it with you always. It became your banner not raised high, not flung with trumpets, but tucked close, quiet, silent, but constant. It reminded you that being alive is its own kind of knighthood. Spring returned slowly, as it always does, not with celebration, but with softness, the kind that seeps in without notice, and with it came a summons. You were to be knighted, not for any single act, not for victory, not because you had slain or conquered, but because of all the moments that no one recorded, because you did not run, because you listened before speaking, because you waited before drawing steel. They said your name aloud in the great hall. You knelt. You did not tremble. You burned, not with pride, with quiet certainty. It felt like a door closing without a sound, and another opening just as gently. The sword touched each shoulder. The room blurred, and all you could hear was your own breath and a memory of your father's voice. You'll be strong enough someday. Just not today. But today, you were. Not because of strength, but because you had learned how to hold it softly. They called you sir now. The first time someone said it, you almost didn't turn your head. The word felt heavy. Not from weight, but from echo. It didn't feel like something you earned. It felt like something placed in your hands with trust. And you carried it that way, without grand speeches, without banners, just by rising earlier than you needed, cleaning your own tack, keeping extra bread in your satchel for whoever had none. The squire assigned to you was young, nervous, eyes too wide, voice too quick. His name was Merrin. You didn't correct him when he fumbled. You didn't lecture when he dropped a shield. You just showed him again, slowly. One day, he called you sir, with more steadiness than before. You looked at him and said, "You'll call someone else that someday. Just make sure you earn it first." In silence, your first command came sooner than expected. Ebordispudde. No glory, no heroism, just fields, fear, and farmers who held tools like they were weapons. You were told not to fight, just to calm. You didn't wear colors, no plume, just a plain cloak. You rode Bren. As always, the air was brittle when you arrived. Soldiers stood with hands too close to hilts, voices too close to shouts. You dismounted. You listened. You asked for names, not sides. You spoke less than you thought you would, but you stayed longer than they expected. The blade never left your sheath, and when the tension broke, it didn't snap. It softened. A child tugged your cloak. You look like someone who doesn't shout. She said. You smiled. That evening, an elder gave you a folded cloth, frayed, plain, for remembering. He said, this was your first real victory. You kept it tucked in your belt for years. The years that followed weren't filled with triumph. They were filled with dust, with broken roads and slow rides, with decisions that never felt clean. You stood still when others ran. You kept watch when others slept. You delivered food through a storm and lost 3 toes to the cold. No songs were written, but your name spread in small places, whispered with respect. Not fanfare. He stayed when others left. She listened before judging. That was a night. And you learned, truly learned, that reputation isn't something you build. It's what's left in rooms after you've gone. In the weight of silence, where your presence used to be. You saw war again. Not your first. Not your last. Worse. Maybe you lost friends. Held the hand of a soldier who could no longer see. Carried the wounded farther than your body should have allowed. Wrote letters for the dying. And when the banners were lowered and the horns quieted, you didn't cheer. You sat beneath a burned tree and closed your eyes. The wind touched your face like an old friend who no longer had words. That night, another night handed you a cup of wine. I would have followed you into worse. They said. You nodded. Later, alone, you took out that old folded cloth, the one left by your sickbed long ago. You are still here. You said nothing. It said enough. One winter, you returned home, not to the court, not to the battlefield, but home the cottage near the woods. Smaller now, though perhaps it was always that small and you had just grown around it. The trees were thinner, the path quieter. Your father's tools still hung on the wall. The chair by the fire still creaked in the same way when you sat down. Your mother was gone. Your father, too. But you felt them in the scent of ash and flour, in the way the floor dipped slightly where they used to step. You placed a folded cloth on the mantel. No message. No signature. Just presence. Just proof that you had returned. That the boy who once played knight with puddle sticks and stream stones had come back with something quieter than glory memory. You stayed for only a few nights, long enough to sweep the hearth, to touch the trees, to walk the old paths barefoot, as if reminding the ground that you remembered. Then you left, not to escape, but because your path was not finished. You traveled without urgency, but never aimless. Sometimes the journey was wide, other times no farther than a village downriver. You rode less and walked more. Bren, older now, still proud, moved at her own pace. You never rushed her. You never would. In one village, they asked if you had come to protect them. You said no, only to be with them. That answer confused some, but it was the truth. You were not there to save anyone, only to stay. Over time, you became a story, not a legend, something Keter, a tale shared over bread and fire. There was a knight, they'd say, who buried even the enemy dead, who stayed after the battle, not to speak, but to listen. You didn't hear these stories, but you felt them in the way strangers looked at you, not with awe, but with recognition they couldn't quite name. And that was enough. Your name was no longer something you needed to hear aloud, to believe it mattered. You wrote less and folded more. Each cloth held a line, a moment, or sometimes nothing at all. Some were tucked into chapels, others tied to gates, slipped beneath pillows, or left at the base of trees. Most were found. Some were never seen again. All were placed with care. And once, far from the castle, beneath the wide hush of twilight, a young woman found one of your cloths. She didn't know your name. She didn't know where you'd been or who you'd saved. But she tucked the fold into her pocket and whispered, "I think this helped me stay." You weren't there to hear it. You didn't need to be. That had never been the point. You returned to the tree, once the one you used to sit beneath after battles. The one whose roots once felt like shelter. It was taller now, wiser. Maybe the bark had changed, but the bend of its branches still cradled the wind the same way. You found a folded cloth tucked near the roots, not your own, stitched in faint thread. I hope this helped you become someone gentler. You didn't open it again. You folded it once more, added one of yours beneath it, and sat in silence, just enough to breathe in the memory, just enough to remind the soil. I remember the one who made this possible. You didn't stay long. You never needed to. You rode on, lighter not from leaving things behind, but from knowing you didn't have to carry them alone. The road softened under your steps. In one town, a baker had begun placing cloths in the folds of bread. Small notes stitched with lines, like, "You're doing better than you think." No one said where the idea came from. They just called it kindness. In another place, a carpenter taught their apprentices how to fold linen before sanding wood. So your hands remember gentleness first. They said, no one called it knighthood, but it was. Not with armor, not with ceremony. Just the kind of presence that doesn't explain itself, but is felt. You wrote less, folded more, You spoke even more softly, and one day, a child asked you, "How do I become like you?" You didn't offer a tale. You didn't speak of battles or scars. You knelt, placed a cloth in his hand, and said, "Start by listening to someone who's never been asked how they're really doing." He didn't understand. Not yet. But he nodded, and years later, someone would say of him, "He's quiet, but it helps just having him near." That was enough. The world kept moving loud, fast, forgetting, but those who paused remembered. Those who carried the folds knew, and the path, once narrow, began to widen, not with followers, with companions, not behind you, beside you, in step, not in uniform, in rhythm. You don't remember the moment you began to slow. There was no thunderclap, no wound, no farewell, only a quiet morning, the kind that arrives on padded feet, when the sky is still pale with sleep, and the air holds the hush of things not yet spoken. You opened your eyes and didn't rise right away, not from weariness, but from a different kind of knowing, a soft certainty that nothing was chasing you anymore. The urgency had faded like breath on a mirror, leaving space in its absence. The blanket still draped over your chest was warm with the shape of rest, and for the first time in a long time, you let yourself sink deeper into it. You listened to the room breathing. The wooden walls held the memory of rain. The scent of lavender lingered faintly near the pillow. Dust motes danced slowly through the window's early light, and you watched them not as signs of time passing, but as companions of the stillness. When you rose, it was without armor. You wrapped a cloak around your shoulders not for protection, but for comfort. Your hands moved without haste, folding the worn blanket, placing the cup back on its shelf, pressing your palm to the doorframe as you stepped outside like a benediction. The morning met you without demand. A breeze touched your cheek like someone brushing hair from your eyes. The path before you did not call, it waited. No one was watching. You walked not to arrive, but to feel the weight of each footfall pressed into the earth. And the earth answered you not with speech, but with the hush of softened soil and the whisper of leaves. Each step was a question asked, without expectation. Each breath a reply from the world that no longer needed explanation. You passed through villages with broken fences and leaning trees, towns where no one remembered your name, and that felt like a kindness. You helped lift stones that had sat too long in one place. You paused by wells, not to drink, but to listen to their depth. In one village, a child held your gaze too long, and you smiled without speaking. In another, you mended a door that wouldn't close all the way, then left before they could say thank you. You stopped measuring time by distance. You no longer counted nights. Instead, you began to notice how the wind shifted just before dusk, how the birds grew quiet in the moment, between sun and shadow. You slept beneath trees that didn't remember war. And each night, before sleep, you folded a cloth and placed it somewhere to be found on a bench. Beside a cradle, tucked beneath a threshold worn by many feet. Not all had words. Some were blank. Some held only a single spiral or the gentle curve of thread, but all of them carried presence, a kind of listening pressed into linen, and sometimes, in places you did not expect, you found one waiting for you instead, tied to the leg of a table, in a candle-lit inn, slipped into your satchel, without your knowing, laid gently across a fence post, like an answer to a question you hadn't spoken aloud. You never sought to know who left them. You never needed to. Each fold was a conversation, held in silence. Each touch a way of saying, I saw you, even if only in stillness. And slowly, you began to feel it. The thread that once ran only through your hands, now ran through others too. A squire in the north, a teacher by the sea, a child who had once sat beside a fire and listened without speaking. They were folding now, without waiting for permission, without needing a title, and somehow, that felt more real than anything carved in stone. You didn't feel older, only quieter, as if the edges of your life had softened into something that held rather than cut. You no longer reached for your sword first. You reached with your presence. And often, that was enough. There were places where the silence felt older than the buildings, where moss crept up the stone as if trying to remember how warmth once lived inside. In one such place, a town whose name had long worn away from the wooden sign at its edge. You stayed for 3 nights without speaking to anyone, not because your voice had left you, but because the hush between people felt more sacred than sound. You helped repair a cracked wall behind a small chapel, your hands steady, your breath slow. You swept the worn steps each morning before the sun touched them, and in the evenings, you sat beside the well, not drawing water, only listening to the way the breeze slipped into its throat. On the second night, someone left a folded cloth on the bench where you often rested. The fabric was soft, older than yours, and stitched with a single line of pale green thread. We are still here. You didn't open it all the way. You didn't need to. You held it in your palm like a whisper passed from hand to hand across years. That night, you slept without dreams, and in the morning, you folded one of your own blank. Breath warmed, waited with the quiet and placed it just beneath the window of the home nearest the well. You didn't wait to see who found it. You never did. You only left behind presence, like a candle set down in an empty room, something to be noticed, perhaps only when needed most. The road welcomed you again, not with fanfare, but with gentleness. Stones shifted beneath your soles, without resistance. A branch lifted just enough to let you pass. You walked slower now, not from fatigue, but reverence. Even your shadow seemed more at ease, curling softly across the path, instead of stretching to stay ahead. The sky held more color in it than you remembered subtler shades. Bluer blues. You wondered if it had always been that way, or if you had simply become someone who could see it now. You stopped more often than you once would have, not because the journey demanded it, but because the world offered places that asked to be witnessed. A single wildflower growing from the crook of a wall, a bird preening itself beside a puddle, a pair of worn boots left neatly by a cottage door with no one in sight. Each detail felt like a kindness, unfolding slowly. There was a day you stood by a river too wide to cross, and did not try. You simply sat with it, watched the current, hold its shape, watched the water, make no apology for its pace. You reached into your satchel, pulled a cloth, one you'd folded the night before, with no destination in mind, and let the wind take it. It lifted slightly, then dropped gently into the grass at your side. You didn't move to retrieve it. Some folds weren't meant to travel far. Some were meant to rest, like stones, like breath, and somewhere nearby, though unseen, you felt someone stop to notice. Not you, not the cloth, just the stillness it left in the air. You carried no map now. You carried only signs. The way the air shifted when someone nearby was grieving. The way a dog would sit near a door, too long closed. The way someone's hands trembled when they passed you bread. and how they steadied after you accepted it without a word. And in those moments, you would sometimes fold a cloth, not as a gesture of pity, not even as comfort, but as witness, as if saying, I saw that, and I won't make you name it. You came to understand that most pain doesn't need to be fixed. It only needs to be shared. And cloth quiet. Small, unspoken, was your way of sharing without asking to be invited in. The act itself became its own kind of language, one not limited by distance or blood or even memory. Some days you woke with a heaviness in your chest, the kind that didn't belong to you, but passed through anyway. And on those days, you folded slower, let the fabric teach you where its creases wanted to be. You'd hold it in your hands until it felt warm, until it had listened long enough. Then you'd leave it somewhere open in the crook of a tree, on a worn fence post, beneath a sky beginning to change. You no longer needed to ask if it mattered. You had already seen what one quiet presence could do. You had become someone others folded for, and that was enough. There came a season when the trees held their leaves longer than expected, as if even the wind had agreed to wait. The days stretched with golden hush, and your footsteps felt less like movement and more like continuation of something old, something rooted, something that didn't begin with you, but chose to pass through you for a while. You arrived in a quiet valley where the houses leaned gently into the earth, where people spoke in nods and gestures, where no one asked your name. You stayed longer than usual, not because of need, but because the silence there felt familiar, like something once folded and tucked away, now slowly opening again. You swept the steps of the old chapel without being asked. You carried buckets of water from the distant well and placed them near doors without knocking. You mended a gate that had hung crooked for 3 winters and left a folded cloth in the shape of a crescent on the latch. No one said anything, but the next morning, a loaf of bread waited quietly on the bench where you sat most evenings, its crust still warm, its wrapping soft. You didn't touch it for a while, just rested your hand against it, recognizing the message, I see you. That was enough. That evening, you folded another cloth. This one held the weight of memory, stitched not in thread, but in pause. You laid it by the edge of the field, where children played with sticks and whispered stories into the air. When one of them found it, they didn't shout or run. They picked it up slowly, turned it in their hands, and simply sat with it, as if they understood its softness was meant to be received in stillness. You watched from a distance, not to see what they would do, but to listen for what the moment would become. And what it became was quiet, not emptiness, but space. The kind of space where breath deepens, where tension leaves the body without needing to be named, where something old and aching begins to unclench. You slept that night beneath a sky so wide it seemed to forget its own end. The stars blinked slowly above you, and the earth beneath your back was cool but solid. You thought of the early days of wood swords and imaginary dragons, of aching shoulders and thin blankets, and how long it had taken for your silence to stop feeling like failure. Now, it felt like strength, not the kind that held power over others, but the kind that knew how to remain soft in a world that had tried to harden you. In the morning, you sat by the hearth with the village elder, her hair silver and tied with twine. She didn't ask your story. She only placed a cloth in your hand, coarse, frayed, old, and said, "It came back to us once before. I think it's yours now. You didn't recognize the fabric, but you recognized the fold, The edges were worn the way cloth becomes when held too tightly for too long. You pressed it to your heart without opening it, and she nodded, as if that was the only answer needed. You stayed 3 more days. During that time, you said little. You helped a boy find his lost goat. You carved a notch in a leaning post so the lantern would stop swinging in the wind. You folded 3 cloths and left them in places only those who paid attention would notice. Then, before sunrise on the 4th day, you walked on, not out of restlessness, but because something in you knew the silence had settled and no longer needed holding. You didn't look back. You never did, but you left slower than usual, and your hands lingered on the gate as it closed behind you. The path ahead was soft with dew, and your cloak smelled faintly of smoke and mint and bread. The morning air kissed your fingers as you walked, and the rhythm of your steps matched the hush in your chest. You didn't know where you were going, only that somewhere, someone would be waiting for the silence you carried. And when you arrived, you would know it not by what was said, but by what was finally allowed to remain unspoken. The next place was not marked on any map, though you had passed near it once. Long ago, when your steps were sharper, your breath more urgent. Now, the road to it bent not with signs, but with sensing your body slowing just enough at a certain tree, your gaze lifting toward a ridge, without knowing why. You followed the way the light filtered through the leaves, pale and dappled, like memory, and it led you to a hollow where the grass grew in quiet circles, and the stones looked placed, not fallen. No houses stood there, only the remnants of something held carefully and then let go. A bench without legs, sunken into moss, a well whose rope had rotted, but whose stones remained warm to the touch. You walked barefoot in that place. The earth welcomed you with a hush, the way one welcomes an old friend who's finally come home without needing to explain why it took so long. You moved slowly, touching what had been left behind, not to fix it, only to feel what still lingered. There was a folded cloth caught between 2 stones, faded near colorless from sun and rain. Its edges curled like the corners of an unread letter. You didn't open it. You only placed your fingers along its seam, as if by touch alone you could read the story it once held. It was enough to be near it, enough to witness its persistence. You sat beside it as evening fell, and for the first time in days, you cried not from sorrow, but from the release of something that had held too long without being held back. The wind passed through the hollow gently, like breath over glass, and you let yourself lean into the softness of it, into the place where even silence had a body. That night you didn't fold a cloth. You only rested, letting the world press against you like a blanket pulled high. The stars blinked slowly above, but you didn't watch them. Your eyes were closed. Your chest rose and fell like waves against the shore. You slept without dream, and in the morning, when you rose, your hands moved without instruction. They found the square of fabric in your satchel not new and not planned, and began to fold it with the steadiness of someone who has nothing left to prove. You pressed your thumb into the final crease, then placed it on a smooth stone in the center of the hollow. No words, no sign, just the shape. You walked on, and when you came to a place where the wind carried the scent of flower and pine smoke, where the roofs leaned low as if listening, that you slowed again. You entered the village like a breath, not announced, only felt. Children played with sticks and string, and when they saw you, they did not ask questions. They only made room. You spent 3 days mending fences and listening to the rhythm of spoons in bowls. You noticed the way one man stirred his tea, clockwise, slowly, as if time would shift directions if he changed his pace. You noticed how the woman at the bakery wrapped each loaf as if she were tucking in something precious. You folded 2 cloths and left them where hands worked hardest beside a chopping block and beneath a needles basket. You watched nothing happen. Then everything softened. On the 4th morning, someone left you a folded cloth in return. Stitched with 1 line, you slowed the ache. You carried it with you, not as a token, but as a tether. And when the road opened again, when the hills breathed wide to receive you, you walked forward with your hand resting lightly on your satchel, not to protect what was inside, but to remind yourself that you still carried the things no one could see: softness, silence, and the knowing that sometimes the most lasting gift is presence, gently folded and left behind, waiting for the moment someone is finally ready to hold it. The next village came after a long stretch of open land, where the fields rose and fell, like the breath of something sleeping beneath the soil. You had no destination, only direction, and even that came more from the wind than your will. The sky stretched wide and pale above you, and the clouds moved slowly, like thought. Your cloak caught the scent of distant fires, wood smoke, not danger, and your steps began to match the rhythm of birdsong. When you arrived, the village did not greet you with eyes or voices. It greeted you with stillness, the kind born of waiting, not avoidance. You passed a cart mended too many times to carry weight, and a wall with a crack someone had filled with cloth instead of stone. There was a child sitting alone on the steps of a shuttered home, not crying, just watching the wind move through a garden gone to seed. You nodded. She didn't nod back, but she didn't turn away. That was enough. You stayed in that village longer than you meant to, not because they asked, but because something quiet in you answered. You helped carry water from a spring that ran low in dry months. You rebuilt a small bridge with your hands, 1 plank at a time, never rushing the wood. You spoke little, but you listened carefully to the pauses between the blacksmith's hammer, to the baker's sigh as she turned the loaves, to the way the innkeeper placed cups on the table, as if setting down small, fragile truths. There were days when no one addressed you directly, and you welcomed them, not as rejection, but as trust. People moved around you the way one moves around a steady flame, aware, warmed, but not needing to touch. And slowly, without fanfare, something opened. A man who had not spoken in weeks offered you a chair before he took one himself. A girl with dirt on her cheeks handed you a folded leaf, not with a message, just with care. And on a morning shaped by mist, you found a cloth pinned to the post outside your door, its thread coarse and careful, stitched with only 3 words. You made space. You held that cloth longer than usual, your fingers tracing the uneven seams, not because they were imperfect, but because they were human. You didn't fold one in return right away. You let the moment breathe, let it stretch and soften and fill your ribs with the quiet ache of being seen. That day, you helped a farmer mend a fence that had long leaned into surrender. You asked no questions, but he spoke anyway about the season that never came, the name he hadn't spoken since the last frost, the silence he'd kept out of fear it might unravel him. You didn't answer. You simply nodded, passed him the hammer, and let the weight of being heard hold his shoulders for a while. That night, you finally folded, not for him, for the shape his story left in you. You stitched, nothing, only breathed into the cloth before placing it under the stone near the hearth. Someone would find it. Or not. Either way, it had already done its work. The days passed gently. A woman at the edge of the village began hanging cloths in her window, scraps of linen, bits of old shawls, each folded once, then twice, then left in the sun. You never asked if it was because of you. Some stories don't need a thaw. One morning, you rose before the birds, wrapped your satchel with quiet hands, and walked past the houses without waking a soul. The wind was cool, but not cruel. Your feet found the path, like they had never left it. And as you passed the bridge you'd mended, you saw a cloth tied to the rail, fluttering softly. You didn't take it. You didn't pause. You only placed your hand on the wood, felt its smoothness, its grain, and whispered, "Keep holding." Then you walked on, not toward anything, but into the space the world made when it remembered how to wait. The road after that was quiet, in a way that didn't ask for conversation. It wound gently through low hills, where wild grasses leaned together as if whispering secrets only the wind could carry. The trees here were tall and sparse, leaving enough space between them for the sky to reach all the way to your skin. You walked slowly, not because of weariness, but because the pace of the world had shifted again. Each step felt like something remembered, a path your body had known before your mind had caught up. A bird called once, then fell silent. The sound of your boots brushing through fallen leaves was the only rhythm that remained, and even that was soft. When you stopped, it wasn't because the sun was setting or the path was unclear. It was because you felt something open in the land beneath you, like a breath being held just a moment longer than usual. You stepped off the road and found a small clearing where stones had been arranged into a circle, so worn it no longer seemed made by hands. There was a bench there, flat and low, shaped more by time than by craft. You sat, not with purpose, but with presence, and let the weight of your satchel press gently against your hip. You didn't reach for it yet. You just let it rest. Your hands stayed open on your knees, and for a long time you did nothing at all. And in that doing nothing, everything settled. The aches you'd gathered without noticing, the kind that sink deep into your ribs and nest quietly behind your sternum, seemed to ease. Your breath lengthened. Your shoulders dropped. The world didn't ask you to fix anything. It simply asked you to be here, and you answered by staying. After a while, you reached into your satchel and pulled out a cloth. This one was old, not yet folded, but worn soft by travel, by handling, by the warmth of your body. Over time, you held it in your lap and ran your thumb along the edge, not to check for fraying, but just to feel something familiar. You didn't think about what to write. You didn't think at all. You folded slowly, deliberately, letting the air guide your hands the way it sometimes carried a leaf down from a tree, not with urgency, but with inevitability. When the last crease was made, you set it gently in the center of the stone circle. You didn't press it down. You didn't weigh it with a rock. You just trusted it to stay. And then, without rising, you closed your eyes. The sun had begun to lower behind the branches, and its light spilled across the clearing in long, golden ribbons. You felt it on your face like a soft hand. You let the warmth pool behind your eyelids, let the hush thicken around you like a blanket pulled to your chin. And in that stillness, a memory surfaced, not sharp, not loud, just present. You were small again, your mother humming in another room, the smell of flour on your hands, the world still wide and waiting, You didn't hold on to it. You let it pass through you. Soft and full. A gift, not a burden. When you opened your eyes again, the sky was beginning to dim, and you felt no urgency to move. The air had shifted, cooler now, but still kinned. You rose without sound, gathered your things, and touched the back of the bench once before, turning to go. Your fingers left no mark, only warmth. The folded cloth remained behind you, not as a message, but as a breath made visible. You didn't know who would find it, or when. That wasn't your task. You were only the one who folded, the one who stayed long enough to leave something behind that didn't need to be explained. There was a village near the edge of a forest where the trees grew close together, their branches folding over one another, like hands clasped in quiet prayer. You did not mean to find it. The path you followed was worn but unmarked, a trail carved more by the passing of animals and weather than by people. But you felt it calling not loudly, not urgently, just a gentle tug, the way gravity pulls a leaf to rest. The air was cooler there, not cold, but touched with a hush that softened the bones. As you stepped beneath the canopy, the light changed, no longer direct, but dappled, fractured, a quiet constellation dancing across your cloak and hands. The smell of moss rose from the ground, rich and old, and the sound of your breath became the only rhythm you trusted. When the village came into view, it did not greet you, it simply allowed your arrival, as if your presence had already been expected in the way. Morning expects the dew. The houses were small, curved slightly inward, their wood dark with age and rain. Smoke curled from narrow chimneys. Low and slow, a dog watched you from a porch and did not bark. A woman swept her steps and did not stop. No one asked why you had come, and you offered no reason. You simply nodded, then moved to where your hands might be useful. A broken shutter, a leaning fence, a door whose hinges sang when opened. You fix small things not for praise, not for place, but for the rhythm of doing something with care. And in return, the village gave you space, not absence, not isolation space, a place where no one hurried your silence, where no one rushed to fill the quiet you carried. You stayed in a room above the bakery. The bread there was dense and earthy, the kind that needed slow chewing and left warmth in the chest long after the last bite. Each morning, before the sun fully climbed past the trees, you walked the edge of the forest, not far, just far enough to let the air change around you. You listened to the creak of branches, the shuffle of unseen paws through undergrowth, the sharp hush of a hawk's shadow brushing the canopy. You picked up fallen twigs and pine cones, sometimes stones with strange shapes, and placed them in a small bowl by the window of your room, not to keep them, just to notice. Each night, you folded one cloth, sometimes more. The movements became slower, fuller, like breath stretching wide across ribs, long held tight. You stitched rarely now. Words felt unnecessary in this place. The folds themselves spoke enough, the soft corners, the patience in their creases, the warmth still held from your hands. You left them quietly, on windowsills, in baskets of root vegetables, hung gently over fence posts at dawn. You did not watch to see who found them. You only felt the stillness deepen, like a stone settling into soft mud. One morning, there was a cloth waiting on your doorstep, wrapped in dried herbs, tied with bark thread. Inside, only one line, embroidered in thread, that shimmered faintly when the light struck it just right. You made this place. Remember how to breathe. You held it for a long while, then folded it again and placed it by your chest. Not to carry it forward, but to keep the shape of that moment near. That evening, as the wind began to change, you knew it was time to move on, not because you were needed elsewhere, but because this place had learned what it needed to know. You were not the lesson. You were the silence that let it listen. You left a final cloth beside the baker's hearth, pressed gently beneath a smooth stone. No thread, no name, only the fold warm, steady, enough. The path that followed curved through fields gone silver with morning frost, where the grass bent low and quiet, and the sky hung low enough to touch your breath. Each step pressed into softened earth with a hush, and your boots left marks that would vanish by midday, not erased, but absorbed. The way grief sometimes settles, not as absence, but as shape. You walked without destination, guided by the way. Your shoulders felt lighter, turning left rather than right, by the sound of your satchel brushing your hip in rhythm with your heart. The world no longer asked anything of you but presence, and so you gave it completely, with both hands. With every soft breath you didn't need to name, you passed through a hollow where the trees grew knotted with memory, their trunks bearing the scars of wind and time, and something quieter. There were small carvings in their bark initials, circles, a heart held open on one side. You traced one with your fingertips and left no mark, only warmth. The forest there felt full of stories that hadn't been told out loud, stories held in roots and echoed in branches. You whispered nothing, and still, and it hurt you. That night, you found shelter beneath an overhang of stone, where ivy curled like fingers that had forgotten what they were reaching for. The fire you lit was small, more glow than heat, but it was enough to hold the darkness back with kindness. You unfolded one of your older cloths, one whose edges had softened like breath over time. You didn't write on it. You only pressed your hand flat against it and let the warmth of the flame fill the fabric. Then, as the wind slowed outside the ring of stones, you folded it once, then again, and tucked it beneath the ivy at your side. You slept soundly, not because the world had grown quieter, but because you had. In the morning, you woke with a feeling like still water, not peace, exactly something deeper, something that didn't need to be named to be true. You walked without speaking through the low fog, through a village that looked like it had once tried to disappear and nearly succeeded. Doors were shut, eyes low. The road was cracked, but swept. There was care here, but it was quiet, cautious, the way one tends a wound they've learned not to show. You didn't ask what had happened. You never did. You simply stayed. You helped rehang a door where the hinges had rusted open. You brought buckets from the well and left them without knocking. You shared bread with a man who did not meet your eyes and did not need to. On the third day, a child placed a folded cloth at your feet. It wasn't fabric, just a sheet of paper, torn, uneven, folded 4 times and drawn with a spiral in green chalk. You didn't open it. You placed it in your satchel with the same care as you would a memory. That night, you folded one of your own. In return, no message. Only one thread of green at the corner and left it on the stump where the child had first seen you sit. No one spoke of it. But the next morning, the window shutters were open. Someone had placed a candle in the glass. Someone else left a bowl of herbs beside the gate. and in a village that did not know how to name what it carried. The air grew lighter, not healed, not whole, but held. You stayed 2 more days. On the last evening, as the sun lowered behind the trees, someone tied a cloth to the old boundary post at the edge of the road. No words, just the fold. You touched it once before turning, and as you walked away, your feet pressed gently into the soil, as if even the ground had learned to soften beneath you. You didn't look back. You didn't need to. What mattered had already begun to grow. There was a crossroads you came to one evening, where the light lingered longer than it should have, pooling in the dust like honey, spilled slow. The air was warm with the smell of juniper, and something faintly sweet, maybe berries crushed underfoot, maybe memory itself. You paused, not to choose a path, but to rest. Your knees bent easily now, not from youth, but from having knelt in enough places that the earth no longer felt unfamiliar. The bench at the crossroads was worn smooth at its center, the wood curved from the presence of many. You placed your satchel beside you, let your shoulders relax, and felt the weight of the day begin to dissolve through the soles of your boots and into the dirt below. No one passed. No birds sang. It was not silence. Not really. It was fullness. The kind of quiet that arrives when everything necessary has already been said, and the world no longer needs to prove it's listening. You ran your fingers along the grain of the wood, where someone had carved the outline of a flower with soft, uncertain lines. It wasn't beautiful. It was honest. The kind of shape someone makes when they're not sure what beauty is supposed to look like, only that something needs to be left behind. You leaned your head back and looked up at the sky, which had begun to soften from blue into something bruised and luminous. One star appeared before the others. You did not wish on it. You only watched it arrive and felt your own breath lengthen in response. Sometimes, you thought, stillness is not a place we come to, but a place that comes to meet us. And when it does, we recognize it by how gently it enters the room, how it doesn't close the door behind it, how it waits. When the dark began to gather in earnest, you reached into your satchel and unfolded a cloth that had waited patiently at the bottom. It was thinner than the others, frayed at one edge, where your fingers had fidgeted with it through sleepless nights. You didn't plan to use it here. You hadn't planned anything for it at all. But as your hands moved, the fold took shape the way leaves do when they curl in sleep slowly. Naturally, without instruction, you folded it once, then twice, then held it against your chest, letting it gather the rhythm of your breath like thread. No words, no color, only presence. You placed it on the bench beside you, not in the center, not as offering or farewell, but as a gesture of continuation. Someone would sit here next. Someone would need this softness. You would not be there to explain it. You would not need to be. The bench would remember. The air would carry something of you, and that would be enough. As you stood, your legs ached in that steady, familiar way that meant you had lived well today. You picked up your satchel, slung it across your shoulder with the ease of long practice, and turned toward the left path not for any reason, just because your feet moved that way. The road was narrow, lined with low brush and thick scent. Crickets began their singing. A breeze lifted from somewhere unseen, brushing against your cheek like the breath of someone remembering your name. You did not hurry. You let the night welcome you, and as you walked, you began humming something shapeless, low, a sound that vibrated gently in your throat and reminded you of home. though you could no longer name exactly where that was. You walked as if someone else might be listening, not following, not watching, just listening. And so you made your song kind. You made it soft. You made it real. The path grew thinner as night deepened, winding like a thread, lay gently through tall grass and sleeping stones. You stepped carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for the way the world quieted itself in the dark, for the way your own shadow softened until it was no longer something cast, but something welcomed. Trees leaned closer here, not as walls, but as watchers. You could feel them listening. Each leaf, a slow inhale. Your breath matched theirs. There was a rhythm in it now. One you didn't remember learning, but had somehow always known, the rhythm of moving through the world without stirring it too much. The rhythm of arrival without announcement. You came to a place where the ground dipped low, and a stream ran thin and bright across smooth stone. The moon, nearly full, rested its reflection in the water without trembling. You knelt beside it, cupped your hands, and drank slowly, as if the water carried not just coolness, but memory. And maybe it did. Maybe every drop held something once whispered long ago, something small and kind that needed to be remembered by someone who would listen without taking. When you stood, your palms were still wet, and instead of wiping them clean, you let the cool remain. It clung gently to your skin, like the last words of a conversation that doesn't need repeating. You found a wide, flat rock nearby and sat down, not because you were tired, but because the world around you had paused and you felt it would be rude not to sit with it for a while. There were no stars overhead now, only a thin veil of cloud that shimmered slightly with hidden light. You looked up and felt no need to name the constellations. You simply watched the shape of the sky shift like breath, and your eyes stayed soft, unblinking. You reached into your satchel and brought out a cloth, not one you had prepared, but one someone else had left, folded into the curve of your path, 2 villages back. You hadn't opened it then. You hadn't needed to. But now, under this quiet sky, with the sound of water threading through stone and the trees keeping close watch, you unfolded it slowly. The fabric was coarse and warm from your body. It held no scent but time. Inside, a single word was stitched in thread darker than the night around you stay. You didn't speak it. You only read it with your breath. Let it enter you, like something you'd known before and forgotten gently. You held the cloth against your knee and traced the letters once with your thumb. Then, as if your hands knew something you hadn't yet spoken aloud, you folded it again, not to give it back, but to keep it moving. You placed it beneath a small stone near the stream, nestled beside a patch of moss, where it would be found only by someone who walked slowly enough to notice. You didn't wait. You didn't linger. You only pressed your palm to the stone once, softly, then rose. Your body ached in the quiet way that meant you were still alive. Your satchel rested light against your shoulder, and as you stepped across the stream, stones cool beneath your soles. You felt the word echo through your ribs, not as command, not as plea, but as invitation. Stay, not in place, in presence. Stay in the way you touch the world. Stay in the way your breath leaves room for others. Stay in the rhythm of your folding. You're noticing. You're not needing to be seen. The path waited for you ahead, and behind, and all around, and you walked forward again, not because the journey called, but because you were learning to answer without needing to ask why. You come at last to a clearing that feels neither new nor familiar, as if it has always existed, just beyond the edge of memory. The grass here grows in gentle waves, pale under the moonlight, and each blade seems tipped with silver. You pause at its border, not because the path ends, there is no clear path, but because you sense the air itself has slowed. You step forward into that hush, and the ground beneath your boots seems to welcome you. Its softness, something you recognize without thought. There is no shelter here, no village, no bench carved by hands, only the open sky, wide and unhurried, and the earth that waits to feel your presence. You unshoulder your satchel and set it on the ground, the leather whispering against grass like a secret. You kneel and brush blades aside until the earth shows its dark promise beneath. You settle your satchel beside you and sit, legs folded, hands resting in your lap. The breath you take in is gentle, deliberate, as if drawing in every blade of grass and every pinprick of starlight. You close your eyes and feel the night press its cool palm against your face. You let yourself be held. There is nothing to fix here, nothing to offer except your presence. And yet, presence feels fast, immense, the way water fills every crevice without overflowing. Your fingers drift to the soft bundle inside your satchel. You draw out a cloth, one you haven't touched since the morning. You folded it in a village long past. The fabric is thin now, delicate at the edges, but still warm from your hands. You hold it lightly between your palms and let the night's hush settle around it. You do not unfold it immediately. You let it rest in your hands, absorbing the silence. You feel a connection, as if this place and that moment are folding together in your chest. Then you unfold it slowly, letting each crease open like a petal, each movement guided by something quiet beneath your ribs. Inside, there are no words, only the subtle crease of hope, the weight of unspoken kindness. You lift it to the sky, letting the moonlight pass through its weave, and you see the threads glow faintly, as if stitched with stars. You lower it, fold it again in 3 careful motions, then tuck it into the soil at your feet, pressing the earth gently over its final fold. You do not cover it entirely. Part of it peeks out, a promise beneath the grass. You sit back and let the moment fill. You do not need to stand guard over the cloth. It is safe here, in the place where breath meets earth and sky. The clearing holds no echoes of your footsteps, no trace of your passage, only the lingering warmth of your presence. You lean back on your hands, tilt your face to the sky, and listen to the world. Exhale. The stars pulse faintly, like slow heartbeats, and somewhere far off, a fox cries brief, unhurried, and a reminder that life carries on in soft calls. You breathe in the scent of damp earth and grass, the faint tang of distant flowers you cannot see. Your heart thumps quietly, not in alarm, but in accompaniment to the night's rhythm. You do not reach for your satchel again. Instead, you let your hands rest on the ground, fingers splayed, feeling the clench of roots and stones beneath. It is as if the earth is breathing through you, exchanging breath without words. You feel your shoulders drop, your jaw unclench, the slow resignation of all that no longer needs carrying. You feel the space between your ribs expand, and in that expansion, you sense that the journey you have walked has led to this opening, a clearing not on any map, but in your own self. Time loses measure. You do not count minutes or hours. You simply remain until the sky begins to shift, pale light appearing at the horizon's curve. You do not rise at dawn. You allow the light to come to you, to touch your eyelids first, and move through every fingertip. When the world becomes too bright to sleep through, you stand, your legs stretch, your back arcs gently, and you reach your arms overhead as if drawing the new day into your bones. You gather your satchel and feel the absence of the cloth. You left a weight you no longer feel, and yet its presence lingers in the soil beneath your fingers. You brush your hands clean on your cloak, leaving no trace, only warmth in your palms. You step out of the clearing without glancing back, trusting that the gift you placed will remain until someone else arrives, someone who needs a moment of unfolding. As you walk away, the grass waves in your wake, folding back into itself as if closing around a secret. You do not hurry. You do not look for the cloth. You let your steps guide you, drawn by the next hush you feel in the air, the next place where breath and earth meet. And somewhere ahead, the world holds space for you again, as you carry forward the silent offering of soft presence, of stillness handed gently from one to another, like a folded cloth passed through time. The path beyond the clearing curved through low hills and shallow woods, where light fell in soft layers, and time moved like mist slow, aimless, unconcerned with destination. You moved through it the way a hand moves through water, parting the stillness gently, letting it close again behind you, without ripple. The morning held no birdsong, only the rustle of leaves shifting in breezes too soft to name. Each step you took felt like a continuation of the breath you'd drawn at dawn. And you walked not with intention, but with invitation, your body open, your senses listening, not for answers, but for the spaces between. The trees grew farther apart, and the ground grew more forgiving, moss underfoot, cool and damp and alive. You stopped to rest beside a large, flat stone, its surface mottled with lichen and memory. You placed your hand on it without thought, feeling the temperature held within the night, still lingering, the sun not yet enough to erase it. And as you knelt there, you thought not of where you'd come from or where you were going, but only of how long it had taken for your hands to learn the language of stillness. You reached into your satchel not to retrieve a cloth, but simply to hold its weight again. There was comfort in it, the way your fingers fit around the familiar fold of leather, the way the worn strap pressed across your chest like a quiet reminder, you are still here. And here, in this moment, was enough. You stood again and walked onward. Not far, just to where the ground dipped into a hollow filled with wildflowers so pale they seemed made of breath. You stepped carefully, not wanting to disturb the rhythm they had made together, some leaning east, some west, all swaying in a language older than speech. You passed through them with your hands at your sides, resisting the urge to reach out, knowing some softness is meant only to be witnessed. There was a tree in the center of the hollow, low and broad, its branches curved like a question never asked aloud. You sat beneath it and let your back rest against its bark, rough but steady, and closed your eyes. The wind moved differently here, less like movement, more like presence. It pressed gently against your cheek, ruffled your hair, with the care of something that had watched you from afar and had now chosen to come closer. And as you breathed, you felt again the small, quiet ache that never left you entirely, the one that didn't seek healing, only acknowledgement. You pressed your hand to your chest and let it sit there, not as a gesture of pain, but of welcome. This, too, was part of the rhythm, This ache, this silence, this long, slow unfolding. After some time, you drew out a cloth from your satchel. This one had waited longer than most, its folds still crisp, its threads unbent. You had carried it through rain, through sun, through dreamless nights, never quite knowing where it belonged. But now, your hands moved without hesitation. You unfolded it once, then again, then laid it flat on your lap. No markings, no message, just the faint scent of lavender from some long-ago resting place. You pressed your palm to its center, letting your warmth pass into it like breath. Then you folded it again, slower this time, as if each motion could carry not just presence, but prayer. When it was complete, you placed it on the moss beside the roots of the tree and weighted it with a single smooth stone, the kind shaped not by hands, but by water and patience. You didn't speak. You didn't need to. The cloth would speak in your absence, in your silence, in the way the fold held a softness the world so often forgot. You rested your back once more against the bark, let your head tilt toward the sky, now fading into cloud, and closed your eyes. You stayed until the wind stilled, until the ache softened, until the moment folded into the next. Then you rose, gathered your satchel, and left the cloth behind, not as an offering, not as a farewell, but as a continuation, something still breathing in your absence. As you stepped away from the hollow, the wildflowers parted around your legs without protest. The tree behind you kept watch, and the cloth remained beneath it like a note written in a language of stillness. And ahead of you, the land curved again into a long and winding hush, waiting with open hands to hold whatever you might choose to leave next. The world widened again, but not with grandeur. It widened the way a blanket stretches across a sleeping body, slow and warm and without urgency. The path beneath your feet softened into earth laced with dry leaves and pale dust, and the trees opened just enough to let the sky back in. It was late afternoon, though you hadn't kept track of time, only light, the kind of light that draped itself over the landscape rather than falling onto it. You walked quietly, not to hide, but to remain in step with everything that had learned how to wait. Your cloak brushed against dry ferns. Your breath clouded faintly in the cooler air. Not yet winter, but something leaning toward it. You felt it in your chest, in the way your lungs stretched wider with each inhale, as if the space inside you was growing in rhythm with the land itself. There were birds here, but they did not sing. They moved from branch to branch with the soft rustle of wings, like pages being turned very slowly in a book no longer read aloud. A stream ran near the path for a while, its voice low and steady, and you walked beside it, not looking at it directly, just listening the way you would listen to someone remembering something beautiful and a little painful all at once. Eventually, the stream wandered off, and you let it go without farewell. Not everything needed to be held to be kept. You found a place near twilight where a stone wall, broken and bent, framed a single tree, standing in what had once been a garden. The soil was dry now, the tools long gone, but something of tending remained, some shape in the way the stones curved. In the worn path, still visible between two low mounds, in the tree that leaned gently east, as if remembering the hands that once shaped the world around it, you stepped inside the broken wall and sat beside the tree. Its bark was rough but warm, and its roots rose from the ground in slow, searching waves. You leaned back, your shoulders sinking into the trunk's curve, and let the stillness of the space open around you. The light had faded into that soft, borderless grey that comes just before the dark. You did not reach for a fire. You did not need one. The quiet was enough. You closed your eyes, and in the dimness behind them, you saw not visions, but texture, the feel of fabric beneath your fingertips, the weight of folded silence, the breath of old wood and worn paths. You stayed there a long while, maybe an hour, maybe more, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of your chest. You were not waiting. You were not preparing. You were only resting in the shape of something larger than understanding. When you opened your eyes again, the stars had returned, scattered loosely like seeds across the sky. The wind stirred through the stones and the garden and through your hair, and you felt it kiss your neck as if to say, "Yes, still here." You reached into your satchel and drew out a cloth, this one small and worn soft at the corners. Carried so long, you no longer remembered where it had first been folded. You didn't open it. You didn't need to. You simply placed it at the base of the tree, right where the roots met earth, and pressed your palm to the ground beside it. You closed your eyes again, not to sleep, but to listen with more of you, and in the space that followed quiet, breath held, full, you felt a stillness that did not come from stopping. It came from belonging, not to a place, not to a story, not even to the folds of cloth you had left behind, but to the rhythm itself, to the movement of soft things through a loud world, to the quiet carrying that does not ask to be known. You rested your head against the bark once more, and in the deep night that followed, the tree and the garden and the cloth you had folded all held together the moment of being seen, not by anyone, but by the silence itself. The morning came without color, just a slow lifting of the dark, a thinning of shadows rather than a dawning. You rose with it, not because you were called, but because your body knew. You stretched your limbs with quiet care, your fingers brushing the ground beside you where the cloth still lay, undisturbed, folded as you had left it. You didn't touch it again. Its presence was enough. Its message, already spoken in the shape of its creases, in the way the air moved a little softer around it. You stepped beyond the broken wall and into the grass beyond, wet with dew, the chill curling against your ankles like a familiar companion. The sky remained low and soft, holding back the sun, and your breath left you in visible streams. You walked slowly, each step placed not with purpose, but with attention. A path had formed here, faint and narrow, woven more by animals and weather than by feet, and it curved away from the garden without asking questions. You followed it, along the edge of the field. Small bones had been arranged, in a careful arc, a quiet altar, maybe, or just the work of someone whose hands needed to make sense of small things. You stopped and knelt beside them, not to understand, but to witness. The bones were clean, each one curved with a softness that came not from gentleness, but from time. You touched nothing. You only breathed in the stillness they held and let it settle beside your own. When you rose again, the light had changed slightly. You could feel it in the way the wind shifted against your face, in the way the soil no longer clung so tightly to your boots. There was no village ahead, only a line of trees in the distance and the soft rise of hills beyond them. You walked without map, without compass, with only the weight of your own breath to guide you, and it was enough. The silence around you had changed over the months, no longer something empty, but something shared, a companion that moved with you, that made space for the next sound before it arrived. You passed through a narrow grove where someone had hung bits of fabric from the branches, each one faded and frayed, fluttering only slightly in the still morning air. Some were barely more than threads now, but their motion felt like breath, like prayer, like stories left to be finished by whoever came next. You didn't leave one of your own. You only walked between them with your hands open, your head bowed slightly, and your heart quiet. A few strands brushed your shoulders, and you did not flinch. You let them touch you, as if recognizing something, and in return, you offered your stillness. Beyond the grove, the world opened again, the hills rolling out before you, like a bed long since slept in. You climbed the first slope, slowly, your legs sure, your body leaning into the motion without resistance. At the top, you paused and turned not to look back, but to feel what remained behind you. There were no names, no markers, no proof, but something in your chest softened at the weight of all that had been left. The cloths, the folds, the quiet offerings. You would not return to gather them. That was never their purpose. They belonged where they had been placed, in corners of silence, in doorways and drawers, and beside hearths now glowing without you. You carried none of them now, and yet you felt heavier with meaning. Not burdened, just full, like hands that have held enough to finally feel empty in the right way. You placed your fingers lightly over your satchel, not searching, just feeling the worn leather, the softness of its edges. It, too, had changed. It no longer held what it once did, but it had shaped you, held your silences, your offerings, your presence. It had become, in its quiet way, part of your rhythm. You closed your eyes briefly, let the wind pass through your hair and press gently against your back. Then, without sound, without pause, you stepped down the other side of the hill, your body folding again into motion. The path did not appear, but the land welcomed you still, and somewhere beyond, in a place not marked, another moment was waiting for you to arrive, not with explanation, not with purpose, but only with breath, and the gentle press of your feet into soil, ready to receive whatever softness you were willing to leave behind.